Here's the definition of complex number. The sum or difference of a real number and an imaginary number. It is written in the form a plus bi, where a and b are real numbers and I is the imaginary unit. For example, I is equal to square root of -1. The A is called the real part, and the B is called the imaginary part. So some examples, the way you might see these complex numbers written is maybe you'll have 2 plus 5i. There's your real part, there's your imaginary part. Notice both A and B are real numbers. As another example, maybe you would have 7 minus 8i. 6 plus root 3i. So complex numbers, stuff that looks like this. The expression the square root of x is equivalent to 8i. What is the value of x? All right, so let's see if we can think this through. So we know that we are taking the square root of something, and we want our answer to be 8i when we take the square root of that something. So I'm looking for this guy underneath this radical here. All right, so first thing that jumps out at me is that I have this I right here. So if I think about how do I take a square root of something and get an I involved? Well, that means I have to be taking the square root of a negative. That is the only way that I'm going to have this I part here, or this imaginary unit. Now, the only thing left to deal with is the 8. How can I take a square root and get the number 8? Well, thinking of your perfect square numbers, 8 times 8 would be 64. So if I take the square root of 64, that would give me 8. So my x value absolutely has to be -64. The square root of -64 is equal to 8i. Let's try another one of those. The expression root x is equivalent to 8i root 2. What is the value of x? All right, so once again, I'm taking the square root of something, and I want my answer to be 8i root 2. I'm going to kind of work backwards again here. So one thing, just like the problem before, I have this I here. Well, how can I, what can I take the square root of to get this imaginary unit? Well, it has to be the square root of a negative. So underneath this radical, there absolutely has to be a negative sign, just like the problem before. And here, I'll try to use the same colors. I used orange before, so I'll use orange again. If I have this 8 right here, what am I taking the square root of to have 8? And that would be a 64. So as of right now, I got -64 under here. This is going to give me the 8i part. But notice I'm not done yet. I have this root 2 right here. So what do I need over here so that I'm going to have the square root of 2 over here? Well, I'm going to need a 2 underneath the radical. So there's going to have to be a 2 right here. Okay, and this is 64 times 2. And if you multiply 64 times 2 together, that's going to be 128. So with the negative, we would need the square root of -128. So our x value would just be -128. Let's do one more of these. The expression root x is equivalent to 14i root 3. What is the value of x? So I'm taking the square root of something, and I want this to be 14i root 3. Same as before. If I have this I here, there has to be a negative underneath the radical. How am I going to get a 14 out here? Well, underneath this radical, there would have to be 14 times 14, right? The root of 14 squared, or the root of 14 times 14, is going to give me 14. So I'm going to need to figure out what 14 times 14 is for that part. And then there's also this 3 right here. All right, so with this 3 underneath the radical, I'm going to need a factor of 3 over here on the left. So now I got to do a little bit of multiplication. I got to figure out what 14 times 14 times 3 is. So if I take 14 times 14 and do this multiplication, so I got placeholder 0 here. 1 times 4 is 4. 1 times 1 is 1. And I am looking at 196. Now I also have to multiply that by 3. So 196 times 3, 3 times 6 is 18. Carry the 1. 3 to 9 is 27. Plus the 1 is 28. Right, the 8, carry the 2. 3 times 1 is 3, plus 2 would be 5. So I am looking at the opposite of 588. So the square root of negative 588 is the same thing as 14I root 3. So the value of x, just to answer the question here, would be negative 588.